Mark farms with coffee beans. While Sally is the consumer that demands coffee, Mark is the producer and he will supply the coffee. Supply can be defined as the quantities of a good or service that producers plan to sell at each possible price during a certain period. Hence, Mark has to decide how much coffee will he supply to his customers at each given price. Supply is a flow concept, and quantity supplied is also influenced by various factors. In mathematics, we say the quantity supplied is a function of the independent variable, and we will write it as follows. Quantity supply is a function of... Now, what are these independent variables? What will influence the quantity supplied? First determinant of quantity supplied is the price of a product. Then the price of factors of production. Meaning that cost of making the product. If one of the inputs of making coffee, like the cost of labor, increases, the supplier will supply less coffee. Then the expected price of coffee. If a producer thinks that coffee will be worth much more tomorrow, he will rather sell all his coffee tomorrow than today. Therefore, the quantity of coffee supplied today will decrease. So, the expected price. Lastly, and very importantly, is technology. Technology enables producers to produce more effectively, meaning producers can produce more of a good with the same resources. Improvements in technology will increase the quantity supplied. Quantity supplied is the dependent variable and is expressed as a function of the 5 independent variables. What will determine the quantities of coffee Mark plans to sell? The higher the price of coffee, the larger the quantities of coffee that Mark will want to sell. Mark has to plan long in advance, hence Mark's decision will be based on what his expectations for the future are. If he expects the price of coffee to increase in the future, he will produce more coffee. So he may be ready to supply greater quantities when the price of coffee eventually increases. Mark's decision to produce coffee will depend on the prices of alternative products. If the price of tea increases, he will choose to produce more tea instead of coffee. If the price of coffee increases or tea falls, he will produce more coffee and less tea. If the price of one or more of Mark's inputs to produce coffee increases, like the cost of machinery or the cost of labor, Mark will supply less coffee. New technologies, such as improved production techniques or machinery, will allow Mark to supply more at each price. Once again, we make the ceteris paribus assumption, meaning that all other variables are assumed to be constant, except the price of the product. Hence, the quantity supplied becomes a function of the price of the product. This table, called the supply schedule, shows the quantity of coffee that Mark will supply. We can clearly see that as the price of coffee increases, the quantity of coffee supplied will also increase. This makes sense. As a producer, Mark is willing to supply more as the price of coffee increases because he gets more revenue. Let's draw Mark's supply curve. First, you draw the market with the price of coffee on the vertical axis and the quantity of coffee on the horizontal axis. The axes are the same for demand and supply curves. If the market price for coffee is 10 Rand, Mark will be willing to supply 20 units of coffee. So the market's price of 10 Rand, Mark will supply 20 units of coffee. For a market price of 20 Rand, Mark will supply 40 units of coffee. At a market price of 30 Rand, Mark will supply 60 units of coffee. So there's 30, 60. At a market price of 40 Rand, Mark will supply 80 units of coffee. And lastly, at a market price of 50 Rand, Mark is willing to produce 100 units of coffee. Now let's just connect these lines. to get Mark's supply curve of coffee. Mark's supply curve is upward sloping, depicting the positive relationship between the price of coffee and the quantity supplied. To move from the individual supply to the market supply, all supplies are added together horizontally, just like we did with the market demand curve. The market supply curve shows the relationship between the price of a product and the quantity supplied. The market supply curve is the same as the individual supply curve, with the exception that the total number of firms in the market has to be taken into account, as well as other factors that could influence the supply of a product. Let's have a look at the example of 3 coffee producers: Mark, Jones, and Phil. Here's the quantity each producer will supply, given the prices from 10 Rand to 50 Rand. Let's get the market supply. At a market price of 10 Rand, the market supply will be 20 plus 50 plus 10 is equal to 80. At a market price of 20 Rand, the market supply will be 40 plus 60 plus 30 is 130. At a market price of 30 Rand, the market supply will be 60 plus 70 plus 60. It's 190 units. At a market price of 40 Rand, the market supply will be 80 plus 90 plus 100, which is equal to 270. At a market price of 50 Rand, the market supply will be 100 plus 100 plus 150, which is 350. So this column gives my market supply at each price level. Now let's draw the market supply curve. Let's draw the market. On the vertical axis, I put the price of coffee, and on the horizontal axis, I put the quantity of coffee supplied, or just quantity of coffee. At a price of 10 Rand, the total market supply is 80. So there's 10 and here about is 80. At a price of 20 Rand, the total market supply is 130. So there's 20 and 130. At a market price of 30 Rand, the market supply is 190. So it's just about. At a price of 40 Rand, the market supply is 270. Lastly, at the market price of 50 Rand, the market supply is 350. Now we can connect these dots to get this market supply curve of coffee. Other possible determinants of supply include government policy. Subsidies will influence the supply of a product, while taxes decrease supply. Natural disasters. Natural disasters will have a negative effect on supply. Joint products and byproducts. A change in supply of products that are produced jointly will have an effect on the supply of a product, like sugar and syrup. Joint products are sometimes called complements in production. Lastly, productivity. A decrease in productivity will have a negative effect on supply. Technology can have a positive effect on productivity. A movement along the supply curve can be caused by a change in the price of the product. So if price increases from P to, let's say, P1 over here, then we will see a movement of the equilibrium on the supply curve and an increase in quantity. Any other variable, for example, an improvement in technology, will cause a shift of the entire supply curve. Variables that cause a shift in the supply curve are said to cause a change in supply. There can also be a negative factor, like a natural disaster, which will shift the supply curve to the left.